A big city like London can offer many things to many diverse groups of people. Hazel Fletcher grew up in Lanark in Scotland, where she felt like the only gay in the village. Moving to London gave her the chance to find her tribe and to blossom into her new life in the big city. Nature also offers many things to many diverse groups. And after 30 years as a market researcher in the big city, Hazel has now moved back to Scotland, where she is a volunteer and trustee at Lucky Ewe, that's EWE. Lucky Ewe, a small sheep farm in Fife, offering skills training and well-being support for young people. Today, she talks to MetroWild about the cross-cultural contrasts of Scotland and London, and also city life versus life in rural Fife. This is the MetroWild podcast, where we celebrate city life and wild nature. I'm your host, Lucky Ewe. Hazel Fletcher spent much of her working life in a senior role in a market research agency in London. After years in an office, she loves being a volunteer and trustee at Lucky Ewe in Fife, where she can spend time outside working with the sheep and the land. As a parent to a child on the autistic spectrum, she knows firsthand the difference that positive, affirming experiences and the right type of support can make to the lives and outcomes of young people with different needs. Hazel Fletcher, you were born in Lanarkshire and then moved down to London after university. It was meant to be a short stay, but you ended up becoming a Londoner for 30 years. So what did the big city have to offer you for all those years?
I was born and raised in a very small village just outside the town of Lanark. And I wasn't quite the only gay in the village, but that was pretty much how it felt. So I guess like many gay and lesbian people of my generation, I drifted to the city, tried Edinburgh, tried Glasgow. Not much happening there in the 1980s. So headed down to the Big Smoke with the thought in my head that the streets would be paved with lesbians. And it was an easy transition for me to make because I could move into an aunt's flat. And then really at that time, it did feel like if you were lesbian or gay, that was really where life was at. So for the first few years, it was really all about hanging out in central London, hanging out in Soho, going to the various, bars and things that were there, going to clubs, hanging out in first out coffee shop, trying to, go to the lesbian and gay centre. There was a lot going on in London at that time. So we're talking the late 80s here. And so I got myself involved with a group of women and made friends without really a thought for the future, going to Pride, being a lesbian in my 20s.
You mentioned the Lesbian and Gay Centre and First Out, and all these memories are coming back to me now because I came out in the 1990s and I was living in London at the time. And it was just amazing, all the things that were there. The Wow Bar was there, and all these spaces where you could just drop in and find other women, other lesbians. And of course, now it's different. It's much more open now. We are much more accepted into mainstream society. And so those kinds of spaces are no longer needed, which is a good thing. But also at one level, I feel rather nostalgic for those times when you can just stop into First Out or these places. Oh, and the Ace of Clubs, the club night. So yes, wow, wonderful to think about that. And I think for me, living in London, that was part of the excitement of being in London. At that time, I was in my early to mid 30s, and it still is a very vibrant place for all kinds of diversity.
At the same time, I was starting to forge a career. So I started out doing a bit of work in retail and such like. Then I went back to college and did a business qualification. And then I started out in my career in market research. So as well as sort of establishing a personal life and a network and living the life, as it were, I was also building a career and such like. So then into the early 90s, then I met the person that was to be my partner for the next 20 plus years. we began to live together and ultimately had a child together.
What were some of the things that you really loved about London?
In the early days, it was a place that you could lead a full life as a lesbian. And then I would say then it wasn't really so much loving London. It was just really that I had a life and I had a family, and it happened to be in London rather than that I felt hugely drawn to London, if you know what I mean. For the vast majority of the time that I lived in London, I was in southwest London, Balham, Streatham, Tooting. I used to spend quite a lot of time going to green places within that. So going to Wimbledon Common or Richmond Park or whatever. I guess it was less loving London and more having a family and doing that, as it were.
And so did you feel a sort of tension between, your Scottishness, your love of the Scottish countryside, your family in Scotland, and your family in London? Can you talk a little bit about being a Scots person in London or down south?
Generally speaking, being a Scots person in London is a very good thing to be. People generally have a very positive view of the Scots. So that kind of precedes whatever interaction you have. So you're assumed almost before you open your mouth to be basically a sort of nice, kind, generous, friendly, trustworthy individual. That seems to be the general reputation of the Scots in London. Of course, alongside that, you're also assumed to be, a very heavy drinker and a bit tight with the purse strings, which, so the good comes with the bad. And of course, people remember you for your accent. So there are a lot of business meetings, you meet loads of people and quite often don't really remember them. I tended to find that I was remembered, and I think that's partly because I'm tall, but partly because of my Scottish accent. Yeah, I think probably it was quite good for my career. So that's how it feels to be Scottish in London. In terms of the second bit of your question, did I feel a tension? Yes, always. There was always a conflict in me because it was not my intention really to settle in London. That wasn't my plan. It just kind of happened. And I know that happens for lots of people. And there was always a tension between the family and the friends and the life that I had in London and the fact that my biological family, if you like, were 400 miles away. And so trying to maintain a close relationship with them was a big priority.
So you were able to retire recently and you've now moved back to Scotland and you now live in Fife. What has it been like coming back home to your roots?
Fantastic. Absolutely love living in Fife. Fife is quite a big place and I live in East Fife, and East Fife is extremely rural, and the main thing that's going on here is farming. And that is a lot of arable farming, a lot of horticulture. Yes, a bit in terms of sheep and cows and stuff as well. So I'm really surrounded by beautiful fields. I'm surrounded by fields with sheep in them. Fife is also one of the drier and sunnier parts of Scotland. So apart from the last 6 months when everybody's had terrible weather, the climate's pretty good. So the light is beautiful. So it's just an absolutely beautiful place to stay. The air is fresh and clean. The water's delicious. It's fantastic. So I love being back here. And also I love the life that I have managed to, it's still a work in progress. I've only been here just over a year, so it is a work in progress. But so far, I'm loving the life that I've managed to establish. People are very friendly and open. So 2 things that I've got involved with. First of all, I've become involved with a charity called Lucky Ewe, and I volunteer for that charity, and I'm also a trustee of that charity. And also I've got involved with the local camera club, which is very active. And also I am obviously enjoying being near my family.
So we'll come to the Lucky Ewe, and that's EWE as in the sheep, in a moment. But what I would like to explore with you is, what is it like now, having been the only Scots person in amongst your friends, or one of the few, with kind of standing out because of your accent. You're now amongst people who all sound like you, who are all Scottish, and you're very close now. You're an hour's drive away from your family. Can you talk about how that feels, being now back in Scotland as a Scots person?
Well, it took me quite a while to get used to it in a way, because I used to be walking along or whatever, and people would be coming towards me speaking, in their local tongue, as it were. And I think they're Scottish people, because that was how I would have reacted in London. So I now have got a bit used to the idea that I am surrounded by people with Scottish accents and it doesn't stand out anymore. And I think, in a way, I just feel how to articulate it. I suppose it just is just a feeling of belonging, really, of almost belonging without having to make an effort to belong, because you just are Scottish and you're just accepted. I mean, the Scots have a very strong sense of their own identity, and a very, as a group, as a nation, a sort of pride in being Scottish, and a pride in what Scotland is in the world and has been in the world. So it's actually quite nice just to fit into that again and feel part of it.
So I'm fascinated by belonging, and in fact, MetroWild has a series that I call Belonging, because I come from Malaysia. I live in the UK, South, mainly London, and now Oxford. I feel that I do belong in the UK, but I also, when I go back to Malaysia, there's a kind of, okay, this is my Malaysian side coming out, and I feel connected with the Malaysians that are around me in KL, in Kuala Lumpur, and also the heat, the landscape, the tropical sort of humidity, the food, the smells. But also when I come back to the UK, I go, I'm at home. That smell of rain, that coolness. We joke about it, but it is part of being British, I think. So how important for you is landscape?
I mean, massively, because I was brought up in the countryside, so I'm used to hills and rolling fields and lots of green and all that kind of stuff. So for me, being back here, and I'm just surrounded by green and landscape, yes, it does feel very, this is home. This feels like home. And this is where I never get tired of. I do a lot of driving around to get various places, and I never get tired of just the fact that I'm in this landscape the whole time. I just love it. And when I go to the city now, even though I'm going to smaller cities, going to Edinburgh, going to Glasgow, I don't want to stay there very long.
Yes, driving around and in beautiful countryside is quite different from being stuck in a traffic jam in a city. Can we talk a little bit about language, because there's an article on MetroWild that I've written, which is about mother tongue and English and language, and also language as a way of belonging. I've noticed when we now speak via Zoom that you sound a bit more Scottish since you've been back in Scotland for a year. You roll your R's a bit more, and you've mentioned some things when we've chatted, and I go, oh, what's that? And you then have to explain it to me because you're using a Scottish word. And I think the one word I remember is something to do with rain, a kind of rain.
Yes, I think in Scotland there's quite a few words for rain. There's a language which is Old Scots. So there's a vernacular, as it were, which is Scottish vernacular. And that comes into how people may pronounce just sort of normal words, if you know what I mean. But there's also words that are particular to that language that are still used in sort of common parlance. So dreich, for example, is one, which is, what is it, which we've had loads of dreich days in the last 6 months. And dreich just means, it's grey and miserable and damp. There's also something called smir, which is a kind of a very fine rain. There's har, which comes off the sea quite a lot. I don't know if that's a Scottish one or if that's actually UK-wide, but yeah, there's a Scottish dialect, and it comes from Old Scots, and probably I stopped using it. I mean, I'm not really conscious of these things, but probably stopped using it in London And probably I've now started using some of the words that are commonly used up here. So oakster, for example, rather than armpit. There are various words that are just commonly used up here which aren't in the wider UK.
And when you're with your friends and family here in Scotland, are there ways of sort of phrases that you use, or that's kind of within that are Scottish, that if I was sitting in a fly on the wall, that I would have no idea what you're talking about?
I don't know. I really don't know, because it's just not conscious. I mean, that might be the case. You'll have to tell me when you come up. But I literally don't know. Yeah.
I think with the Scottish accent, you're quite right. Just going back to what you were saying when you were in London, there is this a love of the Scottish accent, which is, I think, why many call centres at one point were using people in Scotland. And I remember I was listening to the Radio 4, and at some point they had a Scottish woman reading the shipping forecast. And I was like, oh, wow. And I kept tuning in for that whole week that she was on to listen to the shipping forecast, because it was such a beautiful voice. But anyway, I digress. You mentioned that you volunteer at the Lucky Ewe, working hands-on with their sheep, and you're also a trustee. Can you tell us more about Lucky Ewe and their work?
So basically what Lucky Ewe is all about is it's all about young people who may be struggling in some way, shape or form. So they might be struggling at school, they might be struggling at home, they might have some sort of condition, or they might be autistic or whatever, that just means that they're having a harder time than other young people. And by young people, I mean, we have generally it's sort of 12 to 18, so the teenage years, but people can be part of Lucky Ewe up until they're 24. And the idea is basically to give those young people just a different experience. For some of them, it may be about actually developing some of the skill set that they might need to find to get to college, or to find a job here working in the farming sector. And for some of them, it's more just about the soft skills. It's more about, teamwork, communication, that kind of thing. The umbrella element of it is that we're trying to give young people an experience where they experience unconditional positive regard. So they're made to feel very welcome. They're made to feel very valued. They're made to feel that all the things that they're contributing are great. So it's to try to, in a sense, boost them a bit. So the aim really is just to, in a small way, just slightly nudge the course of their life, hopefully in a positive direction. And we do that through having a small sheep farm, and the young people, interns we call them, the interns come and they spend a morning a week working with the sheep, and they love it. So we've got dairy sheep, and really the work is all about feeding them, keeping the places that they live clean, making sure they've got water, which is a bigger job than you might think. Making sure that they're healthy, etc., etc. So the day-to-day tasks are all around that, but that looks different at different times of year depending on circumstances. And then, of course, the high point of the year, which we're right in the middle of at the moment, is lambing. So at the moment, we've 20 lovely little lambs, and everybody's, really enjoying that.
And so is there produce at the end? What is the output?
So it is a working farm. Those lambs that have just been born, they'll be with their mums for a few weeks. They'll then be weaned, and then they'll be basically fattened up. Some of them we might keep to build a flock, but a lot of them will go to market, either to be sold on into other flocks or to go for lamb chops, basically. And also, it's dairy sheep. So once the lambs have been weaned off their mums, we will then milk the ewes, and that milk will go to be made into cheese. And then we'll sell the cheese it's a small scale production. And so we generally sell it at kind of Lucky Ewe events like our Christmas market and local community events we sell it at mainly.
So you came to the sheep farm not having worked with sheep. You came from your city life in London. What was that like, your first day being there?
Quite surreal. Yes, it was quite something to be suddenly in a pen. We've got fields and the sheep are out in the fields, but also generally we have got a polytunnel, and generally there's a few sheep for whatever reason in the polytunnel at any one time. So going into that polytunnel and being surrounded suddenly by big hairy sheep, and it was quite a bizarre experience. Yeah, you're used to seeing them out in the fields, and to be just have them right there at your legs, as it were. And our sheep, because they are used to a lot of human contact, they're quite friendly. So they actually do kind of come up to have a bit of a stroke and that kind of thing. They are quite friendly sheep. And then the other thing about sheep is that they're absolutely food mad. So they're not very polite. So the minute you appear, especially in the mornings, they start to think that it's going to be breakfast time soon. And so they start making a right old hullabaloo and just generally getting overexcited. Yeah, very odd experience. And, shoveling sheep poo because you've got to clean out the stock tunnel and all the rest of it. Yeah, most odd after 30 years sitting at a desk.
So can you tell us a bit more about the kind of hands-on work that you were involved in?
A typical morning would really start with cleaning out the polytunnel. So we generally have some number of sheep in the polytunnel. So at the moment, because we're in lambing, then basically in the polytunnel, we've got the ewes who have just lambed, and if they've literally just lambed and the lambs are like a day or two old, they're in little individual pens. And then we've got a sort of a nursery area where we've got the ewes the slightly older lambs that are more like 3 or 4 days up to sort of 7 or 8 days in there with their mums. So the first job is literally getting in with the shovels and the forks and the brushes and shoveling up all the mucky hay and sawdust and straw and getting it into a big wheelbarrow and taking that big wheelbarrow up to the midden and emptying it. So that is generally, and basically the volunteers and the interns work alongside each other to do that job. And that's giving an opportunity for developing relationships with the interns. There's lots of banter goes on, chatting about the sheep, talking about individual sheep and how they are, what's going on with Ella or what's going on with Gladys or all that kind of thing. So that's the first job, and that's a sort of shared job. And then once that's done, then it's moving on to feeding, and that involves both the sheep that are in the polytunnel and also the ones that are out in the fields. And depending on the time of year, they'll be getting different amounts of food. So at the moment, obviously the new ewes in the latter stages of their pregnancy, and now that they're feeding the lambs, they need a lot of food. So the interns are involved in measuring out the right amount of feed into the different, the blue buckets, as we call them. The minute a sheep sees a blue bucket, bedlam, because they know those are the buckets with the food in them. So we get all the food measured out, and then the interns feed the sheep. And I mean, they love to feed the sheep. And I tell you, they're so rude. If anyone who's got dogs knows that if you're feeding a dog, it basically stays out your way till you get the food. The sheep are just like all over the place, shoving you out the way to try to get to the troughs. So the interns absolutely love to feed the sheep. And there's always a bit of banter about, are you going to get out without being knocked over by half a dozen ewes? And so then there's the feeding. And then there's the filling up of the water. And all of that because at the moment we're in a small place, that is all basically done by hand. So we've got a water trough and we've got buckets, and we literally fill up the buckets and walk to the various fields and fill up their water containers. And of course, at the moment, because we've got out in the field, we've got the ewes who are feeding the 29 lambs. They are going through a lot of water because they're making a lot of milk. So they've got the whole row of feeding of water carriers. And yesterday we were literally using the farm vehicle, the Hyson, loading it up with buckets of water, driving down to the field, unloading it all into the things and coming back and doing it again to make sure that the ewes have got enough water. We've then got chickens. So the chickens need to be fed, watered, checked for eggs, let out their coop they get out the coop during the day and wander around the farm. So that all happens. And then not so much at the moment, but generally we've got vegetable boxes and a vegetable garden. So there's a bit of work goes on around, depending on what time of year it is, around weeding or harvesting or that kind of thing.
We referred to a number of sheep by name. Can you tell which sheep is who?
Not all of them, but there are particular sheep, because basically on the farm we've got 24 ewes, we've got 4 hogs, and that's basically last year's lambs that have been kept to build the flock. And we've got 5 tups. The tups are generally kept in another field because they're not very polite when it comes to female sheep. They're not very respectful. So they are kept in another area completely. Anyway, not all of the 24 ewes are named, but there are just particular ones that have stood out over the years and they are named. So there is one called Hazel, number 84. They've all got a number, obviously. So number 84 is called Hazel, and she's had 2 lambs this year, neither of which have been named, but one of them is the weirdest looking wee thing. And we are starting to call him either E.T. We're either going to go for E.T. or guinea pig, I think. But so he probably will get a name.
So what about the interns? Have you had graduates now of interns? And you started by talking about their coming and having some structure and learning some skills and being encouraged to come into their own, really.
We have got people who have come through Lucky Ewe and gone on to do, in fact, Lucky Ewe supports people to do a rural skills course. So we've got people who are doing that at the moment and have done it in previous years and then gone on to find jobs, as it were, in the sector, as it were. And then we also have, which is happening at the moment, which I am seeing, is some of our young people having their time at Lucky Ewe and then going on to either other farms in a volunteer capacity, or we've got links with Fife Zoo and with St Andrew's Aquarium. So the young people go from Lucky Ewe to then, as an intern where they're supported, they then can move on to be an actual volunteer at one of these places, and therefore that hopefully will lead them to something in their careers. And we have some young people who are very set on, I want to be a sheep farmer, or I want to get into dairy cattle, or so they're very focused. They're part of Lucky Ewe, and then they also start to get themselves involved in other farms and go and volunteer at dairy farms or whatever it happens to be. So you definitely see the feeling of, definitely for some of them, that they're moving on. And then for some of them, it's just, like on yesterday, Wednesday morning, they were all sort of 12, 13. So for them, it's just really about just getting back into education a bit, just having an experience that maybe takes them out of the place they'd got to and gets them as part of a wider sort of package to get them back into education.
So why is it important, do you feel, in this present era to support and encourage young people, to engage with farming and livestock animals?
Well, what we're very much about at the moment, aren't we, with the climate emergency, is trying to actually think more in terms of thinking locally. So actually being a bit more self-sustaining in terms of food and a bit less dependent on big lorries and airplanes and such like, bringing our food to us. So I think from that point of view, it is really important to be encouraging agriculture and horticulture in the area that we live in. And Lucky Ewe is part of that. And Lucky Ewe is sort of networked into other organisations like Sustainable Cooper and things like that, where it is really all about trying to live more sustainably in a way that's kinder to the environment and is looking to the future in terms of trying to address, in a very tiny, small way, trying to address some of the issues around climate change.
I was speaking with Hazel Fletcher, trustee of Lucky Ewe Sheep Farm in Fife. You can find credits, photos and links to some of the things we talked about on the show notes page. Go to metrowild.co.uk and search for Hazel Fletcher. The views expressed by my guests are entirely their own and do not necessarily reflect my views. This podcast is part of the larger MetroWild magazine-style blog. Go to metrowild.co.uk to have a look at the range of articles featured there, all about city life and wild nature. And if you've enjoyed this conversation with Hazel Fletcher on the MetroWild podcast, you might like to have a listen to some of the other episodes. There's another conversation about the UK North-South contrast when artist Chris Otley talked to me about how his childhood in Northumberland and his adult life in London and Oxford informs his work. That's in episode 5. For a story of an international cross-cultural experience, you can try episode 4, where I talk to Joanne Ewe, founder of the EA Sustain Festival, about what it was like to move to rural Suffolk in the UK after living in the frenetic cities of New York and Hong Kong. I hope you will follow the MetroWild podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Audible. It's free. New episodes will then appear in your pod listening app as soon as I release them into the wild. A handy link to find the podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. The link to the full MetroWild multimedia magazine again is metrowild.co.uk. You can also like or follow the MetroWild Facebook page at facebook.com/MetroWildUK. MetroWild is also on Instagram as @MetroWildUK. I'm Yang Mei Uwe. You can find me on social media with my personal handle, which is @TigerSpiritUK. The Podfollow link again for this podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.